didn't have the screen on, so I wasn't sure whether that was something I needed to react to. No worries, sorry. Yes, and yes, so he stands for this moment when sort of it becomes more clearly defined, which also is due to events happening like the split in the First International, the Paris Commune, and so forth. So I really think the 1870s are this kind of threshold moment. And to better understand like the worldview that he generated, I want to look at his world, by which I also mean, on the one hand, like it's the age of high imperialism, positivism in science, and faith in like unfettered progress, but also like his more immediate network of anarchists and geographers. And for those of you familiar with Federico's work, like this connection will hardly be news. So I won't go into detail here, except perhaps to explain why I think that Élysée Reclus is so important to make sense of Kropotkin. So they both knew each other and collaborated for quite a while when they were both living in Clarence on Lake Geneva. And they didn't just collaborate in matters of politics, but also like in geography. Like I don't need to mention in this group that Kropotkin was a professional geographer. He was trained in the Russian Imperial Administration and explored and mapped the newly annexed territories in Eastern Siberia. And I'm very excited that Chris is here, because the Siberian Diary will finally be coming out in English, and people will be able to see like the evolution that we see from his Siberian years to his later writings, which I think are quite different. And Reclus, on the other hand, like he's probably more known as a geographer. He writes this 19-volume universal geography, the Nouvelle Géographie Universelle, to which Kropotkin also like contributed and is credited as one of the contributors. And there are like, if we take just this one project, there are a lot more anarchists in it. There's also like Lev Michnikov, who lived in Italy and Japan and was the personal secretary of Reclus, or his cartographer Charles Perron, who was a founding member of the Jura Federation. And then they also like, if we take this smaller network as a starting point, we come up with figures who weren't necessarily anarchists, but certainly had socialist sympathies. I'm thinking here, for example, of Patrick Geddes. And there were also like wider networks of family members and so forth. And some of the questions that I think we still need to look further, like I've said, there is a lot of work on these connections by now, but I think, for example, the Russian connection, because almost all of these people had some kind of connection to Russia. Charles Perron had trained in Russia. Reclus' brother Illy was a correspondent for a Russian journal. So I think this is also something that we could perhaps discuss more. But I really want to focus on the geography for now, because I think this is essential for understanding this global vision that I want to sketch out in, I'd say, four main ways. And I will just quickly walk you through these 4 points, which hopefully at some point will each be a chapter in the larger book. But I hope that I can give you a sense of what I mean by this sort of very ambivalent term of thinking globally. So first of all, it is an argument of presenting anarchism as a universal science. Because in my view, the strongest connection that we find between anarchism and geography is not so much in looking for a specifically anarchist approach to geography, but rather the other way around, that anarchy is defined as a scientific approach to politics. And what I would have done, like on my slides, maybe we can do that later, is to compare the way Kropotkin defines anarchy and the way he defines geography. And I think they have a lot of similarities, because they both stress a sort of broad sweeping, almost like meta-scientific nature of both. So in Anarchism and Modern Science, Kropotkin defines anarchy as a world concept based upon a mechanical explanation of all phenomena, embracing the whole of nature, that is, including in it the life of human societies and their economic, political, and moral problems. And then very similarly, geography, on the other hand, he describes as, and that's the citation here, should be treated as a philosophical review of knowledge acquired by the different branches of science. So both of them have in common that they sort of bring together the different types of knowledge about the world and try and reorganize and structure them. But geography stands out amongst the sciences as the only one to really connect a humanistic and a physical strand, and to have this kind of bridging function. But if it came to like picking between the physical and the human side, I think Kropotkin would always have been on the physical one. And some of the quotes are like, I find it always reading him, like the moments when I get the sort of largest, biggest experience of strangeness from, like, say, modern anarchist texts, is when he has these really like materialistic, positivistic, or just quite simply like 19th century arguments where science really emerges as a neutral, universal, and unmistakably progressive language. And I think the argument about anarchism as a science is so important because it allowed to present anarchism as resolutely modern, and to also like place it at the polar opposite of the scientific socialism of the Marxist adversaries that he was trying to argue against. And he really likes to use words like pseudoscience or the idealism or the metaphysics to ridicule the Marxist pretense at materialism and scientific soundness. So anarchism is the like true materialism, and its strength is that it relied on natural science alone. But I think that that is only one side of the picture, and we have to take more seriously what I like to think of as the sort of cosmological or slightly more esoteric, if you will, dimension of it, which is really anarchism, and that will be my second point, as a holistic reflection on global space and scales. And geography, of course, very fundamentally relies on the category of space. This really distinguishes it from the more time-centered models of Marxism. And Reclus, for example, in the Nouvelle Géographie Universelle, there are these bits where he really says, okay, we can skip historical stages. Like talking about Russia, he sees a real possibility that it won't have to go through like a predetermined course of historical stages, but he says her movements will be faster, history will rush for her. So there is a real possibility of skipping stages. And I think this also goes to show that the category of time hasn't completely disappeared. I mean, these people come from Swiss watchmakers, so clearly they do care about time still. And but I think history always emerges as a function of space. So Reclus talks of the milieu a lot, and by this he means like the specific geographical conditions that explain the varieties in the course of history. So we don't have just one predetermined way, but it opens up the possibility of different histories, so to speak. But at the same time, we find expressions like that race is presented as the daughter of the earth, or that he talks about the anthropoplastic property of the milieu. So there is a certain, like what we would today think of as determinism, but at the end of the day, it's always about human action upon the environment. And it's also I think the milieu is best thought of as a kind of relational concept. So Reclus is really interested in connections. So he gives us maps of steamships and telegraphs across the Mediterranean, travel times from Paris, and he plays with different map projections to sort of get different points across. So there's always like a notion of a certain relativeness. And I think Federica has very impressively shown that a lot of these maps are very political. So it can be things like comparing the size of Britain to India. It can be things like mapping the entire population of the world on the space of Paris to make clear, well, there is enough room and space on the earth to nourish us all. So there is a clear political sense. And I guess if space is political, this raises like the questions that I'm probably still most struggling with is like, is it a form of geopolitics? And does the notion of geopolitics in any way help us make sense of anarchism? I mean, it's first of all, and that would be the third point, like it's first of all anachronistic, but it could have like analytical benefits. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that there are, if I speak of these networks and contexts that Kropotkin is engaged in, it's not just the anarchist geographers, but it's also like very sort of traditional right-wing liberal figures, And the classical founding fathers of geopolitics, like Friedrich Ratzel in Germany, the person who coined the term Lebensraum, or Halford Mackinder, the founder of the Heartland theory and sort of British geopolitics. There are like clear examples. With Mackinder, they planned to edit a book series, which didn't happen in the end, but we find an official announcement. And I think the other interesting thing about the geopolitics point is that in both cases, it's connected to a biopolitical argument. So a lot of the geopolitics comes from like a Darwinist rhetoric, which of course we also have in Kropotkin, but this also shows that like you can have a same like intellectual model or pattern of thought, but fill it with very different political contexts, so that they both rely on Darwin and evolution doesn't mean that it leads you to the same political conclusions. But what I think is similar also is that there is a certain sense of expansiveness, territorial expansiveness. And this book series, and I think this will lead me to my fourth point, was meant to appear under the header of science and education. So there's always like in all of these, in geography, and so forth, there is a certain educational thrust. And this would be my fourth and final point, that anarchism can be thought of as a project of cosmopolitan education, because geography has historically often been regarded as a propedeutic to the other sciences. And all of the people that I've mentioned so far, like Kropotkin, Metchikov, Perron, Reclus, they all published pieces on geographical education. Geddes organized summer schools in Edinburgh, and the most famous piece would obviously be Kropotkin's supplement to the 1885 John Scott Kelty report on the state of geographical education in Britain, and the essay known as What Geography Ought to Be. And then there's not just this theoretical engagement with education, but there's also a very like practical and hands-on and material aspect to it. And I'm thinking here of both Reclus projects for a great globe, which maybe you've seen pictures of. If not, I'll show them later. So the idea was that for the Paris World Exhibition, you'd build a globe, a walking globe, half the size of the Eiffel Tower, which sadly never materialized. But it was interesting to see like how this was really a project that was co-sponsored by different people. So Geddes wrote about it that globes must be temples themselves. They will belong to all men without any privilege of race or nationality. They will help to strengthen the feeling within us that we are one and the same family. So the underlying assumption is that there's a real power that comes with understanding the workings of the world, and that sort of if each human being is aware of their smallness and position in the universe, this would bring forth like an improved understanding of a common belonging to mankind. And I think the main point here is that the importance that the anarchists attach to consciousness, and you might even say global consciousness. And so in Reclus' last work, L'Homme et la Terre, there is like as an epigram or as a motto at the beginning, man is nature becoming aware of itself. L'homme et la nature prenant conscience d'elle-même. And conscience here is both conscious and consciousness. So it really is about this connection between both awareness and action, and that knowledge about the world is a key to changing it. And I'm going to show you the illustration later, because it's really these hands that are sort of appropriating a globe or the earth. Maybe you've seen it before, but I will show it to you in a second. And he also, like Reclus writes, for example, he always writes about the material unity of the earth having been established, and now it's about creating a moral unity. And Patrick Geddes's Outlook Tower project, very similarly, sort of he builds this tower in Scotland, in Edinburgh, that has 4 different levels: Scotland, the world, reaching from Scotland to the world, and like going through these different stages would make you feel connected, and it becomes this sort of symbol for the world. And we also find this sort of this connection between small and large units, this biological organicist language in Kropotkin, when he stresses that even boundaries between individuals might not be as rigid as we think we are, because humans are just federations of organs, who are in turn federations of cells, and so on. So while an individual, of course, like matters, there is a real question there, what an individual even is, and to what extent we are able to live independently, because the whole point of mutual aid is our codependency on the world around us. And there is really nothing stopping us from seeing the whole world as a potential endpoint and destination. And anarchism for them is really working out the harmony between these, the universe as a whole and these smaller units. And I think I like that in mutual aid, he offers this nice wordplay on the double meaning of the Russian word mir, as both the village commune and the world, because he describes the social organization of the Russian village as the universitas, a world in itself. And that's really, it can be both the village commune and the world, and they sort of mirror each other. And I think that there is, and that's the part where I'm still sort of really working on, because I've originally like come more from the geography angle, and I'm sort of going more and more in the direction of this, what I'm tempted to call global thinking, is that historical progress tends towards a transgression of space and overcoming of all territoriality. So I think Kropotkin mentions that like the commune at some point will be like federations all over the globe defined by similar interests rather than by spatial unity. And we have these indications that anarchy can only succeed if it's really implemented on a global scale. So when we think of Kropotkin's account of the medieval cities, which is always seen as like one of the best examples of voluntary social organizations, when it comes to explaining why it failed, it's always that they failed to integrate the surrounding countryside into their organization. And it's also the argument why the sort of primitive anarchy that Reclus and Kropotkin find among the Cabal people, or like some idealized Vedic times, they are progressive, but they're too limited and too detached from the larger social context to succeed. And even like Kropotkin's analysis of the failure of the Paris Commune, it wasn't just electing a parliament and sort of going for the statist model. It was mainly the failure of that government to engage with other communes. And in the conclusion to the 10-year anniversary commemoration essay is that the communes of the future will succeed precisely because they will be anarchist within the commune as they will be anarchist outside it. And thus only will they avoid the horrors of defeat, the furies of reaction. So progressive ideas could only evolve if they evolved in line with their geographical scope of application. And mutual aid, and I think that's part of the reason why mutual aid, it really goes from the clan to the stem to the federation of stem. So there is like this progressive narrative. And Reclus talks about the international as something similar to that. And I see that I'm coming to the end of time, so I'm going to skip a bit here. Yeah, but let me just finish by saying that, like, I think Reclus really puts it down when he describes as the future civilization having its center everywhere and its circumference nowhere. So it is about the view from nowhere, which I'm going to show you in a second, that could be harder to get to than we might think it is. Okay, and now let me move on to just a very quick tour of some images if I still have time. Would that be okay?
I think we can
How
take
are
a
we
few
doing
more
for
minutes.
time? Okay, well, let me see. Where can I share? Where's the, sorry, where do I have the share button?
At the bottom where you have your mic and camera, you have a screen.
Yeah.
If you click on it, that should work.
Okay, yeah, here's the, okay, let me just, Can you see it now?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, so this is the cover page of Reclus' last work. So it's really man looking at the earth from nowhere. This is the sort of founding fathers and the events that he brings together. They also look a lot like each other, so that's another argument for putting Reclus and Kropotkin in the same context. This is the village where they sort of collaborate, mapped by Kropotkin. This is the project on which they work together, the Nouvelle Géographie Universelle. Mr. Mechnikov, Charles Perron, here next to Bakunin, Patrick Geddes, and that they're all like part of this larger network. We'll hear about Marie Goldsmith in a bit. The 4 points that I sort of tried to bring together, the definitions of anarchism and geography. And yeah, this is like the types of illustrations that we have. So if the argument is that it's completely free of geographical determinism, I'm always a bit uneasy. The maps about the Mediterranean as a connected milieu. Here we really see the different projections at work, and these maps.
Sorry.
Pardon?
Sorry to interrupt. I think people cannot see the following slide, just the first
one.
Oh
no. Okay. So how do I do this? How do I fix this? Okay. Because I am actually, hang on, this is not good.
We can see you move the window.
Okay, wait,
Can you click on them on the left?
Okay, well, maybe I just need to like, maybe I can't, because I went to presentation mode, but maybe that's not how it works.
Oh yeah,
is it working now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, sorry about that. I think I'm just not gonna do the presentation mode then. Yeah, this is Clarence. I don't want to overstep my time as well. This is the Nouvelle Géographie Universelle, so it's quite a chunk. Mechnikov, Perron, Geddes, the network, like some of the people that I've mentioned, the larger points that I tried to make. The 2 definitions. Okay, let's have a look at the maps, because I think they're always the best part. Yeah, here you really see the projections, and these like sort of subtle political messages, or not so subtle, sometimes they're really in your face. This is the Paris map with the entire humanity on the space of Paris. Here we've got Mackinder's announcement of his collaboration with Reclus and Kropotkin, the famous globe. This is the frontispiece that I mentioned about global consciousness. The Outlook Tower project with Edinburgh, Scotland, the English-speaking world, Europe, and the world, and then you sort of step out and come into the actual city of Edinburgh, but having like acquired all that knowledge. A nice illustration of the International, and yeah, I'm not going to do like the long quotes now, but I'm just going to say thank you very much for your attention and patience, and sorry for all the like technical issues. I hope that we'll have a good discussion. I'm really looking forward to Shangshang's paper now.
Well, thanks a lot. That was really super interesting. So thank you for that. If Shangshang wants to go next with the presentation, and then we can have a discussion with both your presentation, if that's okay. Cool. Yeah, you're on mute. Thank you. So yeah, about 20 minutes. If it's a bit more, that's okay. We have a bit of time.
I think it's about 15 to 20 minutes. I think we have
perfect
time. And first, thank you for holding this fantastic event, and thank you also for Pascale for having this interesting discussion about Kropotkin's world in this global ecologies. And actually, I think my presentation today resonated pretty well with yours in terms of its universal or cosmopolitan education. Can I I have a PowerPoint, and I have. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
But maybe try and move slides to see if that works.
Now?
Yeah, it's moving.
Yeah, we
right.
can see perfectly.
Okay, great. Actually, today's talk originates from part of my dissertation in progress, which looks into anarchist evolutionary imaginations with a focus on 20th century China and Japan. And one of my primary interests is how transnational activists and scientists develop concrete visions of nature through studying organisms, plants, and animals. And following this, I also ask how these ideals negotiated forms of knowledge on particular historical settings in transnational China and Japan, and also in Europe. And today's talk is a particular case study on Kropotkin's Chinese refractions. I'd like to intentionally zoom into a Chinese biologist, Zhu Xi's life and writings, because although he's not necessarily the main character or the protagonist in the story that I'm writing about, is the most intriguing yet long forgotten figure, and I choose him today also because I think he fits perfect well in Kropotkin's global ecologies. And in the rest of today's talk, I try to analyze his two writings. One is his Chinese translation of Kropotkin's Mutual Aid, and the other is related to a Chinese anarchist popular science project, and it is his original work on the region, which is called "On the Origin of Love." Actually, I use a question mark here in translation because I think I would like to leave it for you all to think about, and I will go back to this slide at the end of my speech after I'll show how local translations of a global concept goes tremendously beyond word-to-word translations or mappings. So to give a brief introduction, Zhu Xi was a Chinese biologist and a popular science writer, and most importantly, a life supporter of Kropotkin. We don't know much about his early life, but it's a time when China experienced numerous defeat from imperial powers, both from the West and Japan, and it was during that time that social Darwinism of Spencer was known in China as the only way to survive among world civilizations, and like the weak are conquered by the strong, and the stupid are enslaved by the intelligent. And this sentence already became a slogan of the time for China's national self-strengthening and even national rejuvenation. And in 1919, during the famous social chaos of the May for Student movement, Zhu Xi was expelled from school, but on the other side, he's lucky because he was introduced to Wu Zhihui, who was at that moment based in Paris, and he and his friends, as self-proclaimed anarchists, initiates a work-study program in both France and Belgium, with the aim to send the young Chinese to work in factories in Europe as a way to pay for their tuition fees in the university. and Zhu Xi set off for France under this movement. And we can see in the first photo, Zhu Xi was standing on the fifth from the left. This photo is actually taken during his life working in the factories in the city of Le Creusot, if I pronounce it right. In 1925, he entered the biology department at the University of Montpellier, and 6 years later, he earned his doctorate. And it was during this time in France that he became widely acquainted with anarchist circles in Paris. And during one of his visits to Jean Gauve's place in Paris, he even got the chance to talk to Sophia Kropotkin, which is known for Kropotkin's wife. And through one of his conversations, he actually started to think about translating and even rewriting Kropotkin's mutual aid. And so he said, and I quote, finally, Madame Kropotkin also urged us to write about the mutual aid of the Chinese and to make it public, so that the world may be more aware that the power of mutual aid is indeed universal among all mankind. And 5 years later, after this talk, Zhu Xi actually his first version of translation of mutual aid. But as a proper translator, Zhu Xi actually developed and wrote a whole chapter worthy of 28 pages on mutual aid among Chinese, right after the appendix of Kropotkin's original. Mutual aid in this translational or refraction of Kropotkin's original mutual aid also became something of true Darwinism, because Zhu Xi also added a long preference before the original Kropotkin's preference. And it first starts from talking about Darwinism, but then it goes further to redefine the position of mutual aid in Darwinian theories. He argues that it is improper and even incorrect to attribute the theory of mutual aid to Kropotkin, because mutual aid is a correct interpretation of what Darwin really meant. And he even goes as far by saying, and I quote, it was not of humbleness, he had that right, for it was Bates, and Bates here refers to Henry Bates, a friend of Darwin's, who said that Kropotkin's views on mutual aid are true Darwinism. As for the struggle between claws and teeth, it's merely Huxley's excessively narrow interpretations of the competition for survival. And he also continues, Kropotkin's theory of mutual aid is supposed to be a sequel to On the Origin of Species. And it is said that after Huxley saw the evidence provided by Kropotkin in this theory of mutual aid, he has changed his mind. And one interesting thing in Zhu Xi's self-written chapter is it also deliberately avoid discussing Chinese cities. He argues that although mutual aid is prominent among urban workers and merchants, Chinese cities have tended in the recent several years Europeanized. So this phenomena have already been discussed in Kropotkin's original work. So mutual aid in Chinese countryside is the most relevant to discuss in his self-written text. This is because, and I quote, "The construction of Chinese countryside existed before Confucianism, before Buddhism, before the nation state. This driving force originated in animals and evolves over millions of years. This is the power of mutual aid. It is a force that has penetrated the Chinese people's heart and becomes an instinct that is practiced from generation to generation without being conscious of it." Moreover, Zhu Xi actually also put 31 illustrations as evidence from other books as a way to support Kropotkin. He also has grouped these illustrational paintings under themes such as mutual aid among animals and community lives, but actually I couldn't find them anywhere in this edition that I could access on the digital archives. But actually, there is a clear reference to these illustrations in Zhu Xi's author's note. But I think that's something that I need to explore in the further steps. And also go back to the table of contents in this Zhu Xi self-written chapter. Besides citing Chinese countryside exclusively as a perfect locality to practice mutual aid, another aspect is his way of structuring. He started, we can see here, he started from discussing mutual aid in women and children, and then he went on with the subject of peasants. And for example, here in the subchapter mutual aid among women, Zhu Xi actually only focused on the mutual aid during women's childbirth as a concrete example. And he argues in this subchapter that all knowledge about pregnancy, about mother and baby caring during and after childbirth, all come from women in the neighborhoods who teach and learn from each other. Because, Zhu Xi says, in Chinese society where men are superior to women, there has never been a special institution to teach women general knowledge about childbirth. And here, it seems that Zhu Xi has intentionally avoided a historical account of change as Kropotkin did, but rather he described countryside as organized in a way that was devoid of a sense of temporality and locality, because he underlines a universal standard without specifying regional traditions or cultural practices. Or in his example, when women delivered babies, he even completely ignored the function of hospitals or the functional presence of doctors and nurses. And the way of deduction from higher animals, from lower animals to higher animals, and finally to human beings is something I also want to talk about, because this deduction method as a scientific thinking has largely shaped Zhu Xi's other writings. For example, in his on the origin of love, he actually completely adopted Kropotkin's way of deduction and induction. And he started from talking about 3 kinds of love, which are heterosexual love, motherhood, and friendship. And then he took all the pains from unicellular organism to lower animals and to higher animals. And only after this long description and depictions of these living things, he comes to develop his own argument in human beings at the very end. And one last interesting thing is about the illustrations in this book. He actually used examples from a lot of Western biologists, such as Darwin, as supportive evidence in his own book. We can see and in the figure 6 and figure 7, figure 6 actually depicts the decoration of male cock, and figure 7 depicts a male bird who is performing dance rituals, and the female birds are watching from their nest. And actually, they are all grouped into themes such as motherhood, such as love among animals, motherhood among invertebrates, and also various nest, friendship among birds and animals, and social life of monkeys. So they're sophisticated group in these themes as a scientific evidence to support his own argument. So it comes to the end of my presentation. It will be a very short reflection because I am still in the middle of analyzing my materials. What I want to say through these materials is, I think it's important to always see the complexity of how global concept goes local. And I think my case actually served as an example to counter the assumptions that translation is a mere word-to-word mapping process, or any assumptions that knowledge is unidirectional and it flows from the West to the rest. But rather, I think it was a process which are transformed and negotiated by people with voices and intentions, and also is highly historically situated and situated in different historical contexts. And thank you for tuning in and paying attention. And that's basically the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. And I can see in the chat, people also think it was awesome. Pascale, would you mind coming back on the camera, maybe? So I think now we can start a discussion and ask people for questions. Or if you have questions for each other, please feel free to go ahead too. Yes, so people, either you can post in the chat or you can request to join the audio and video if you want to ask in person. And Shangshang, I saw you raised your hand. Do you have a question for Pascale? You're muted.
Yeah, I actually had, because I think I would really love to hear more about this relationship between anarchist ideas and education, and regarding cosmopolitan education. And I think that's something that also appeared and revealed a lot in this Chinese and Japanese anarchist educational program, and even the popular science and popular science project in what in their words called encyclopedian project. And I think it's really interesting to hear more about your thoughts about this aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really huge aspect, obviously. Yeah, there are many different ways
You're
in which.
muted, Pascal.
Oh, sorry, am I still? It shows. I can see. I did unmute, and I can see the little green bar ticking.
Oh, I just unmuted you.
Okay. Sorry. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so.
Okay. So I think, I mean, education. It's a huge topic. There's different ways you can take it. I mean, I'm interested first of all in how it connects to geography, because a lot of the writings are about geographical education and sort of geography as a practical way of preparing the human mind for experiencing nature and accessing the sort of modalities of the world. I'm also interested in education as a political project, because I mean there is this whole argument, which I don't entirely buy, that sort of the anarchists that I study, that they become a bit mellow as they grow older, and that they're not really that interested in revolution anymore, and that they become like reformists, to use like the evil term. But it's a bit like, I think that they don't completely go in that direction, but I think education does take up a central role when it comes to how do we actually change society. And I think because consciousness as a concept is so important, you cannot really do that without raising awareness and raising that. I guess the final sort of broader point about education that I find important and interesting is that it's never just about children. Like, that is one bit, sort of how do we change schooling, how do we raise children, like not in the prisons that schools are right now, but sort of in nature, and how do we raise them to be free, like how do we educate them in a way that's not authoritarian. But it's also like, I think especially people like Geddes and Kropotkin, they're also really interested in adult education, and the Nouvelle Géographie Universelle to a large extent is such a project, as is building a massive globe that you can walk in, as is like the Nouvelle Géographie Universelle, these 19 volumes that I showed you on the slide. They are published as like monthly or weekly installments that are really cheap to buy, and that a lot of anarchist reading groups and stuff will have. So it's also like this idea of popular education is also like part of the whole debates in education. Does that answer your question, or is there sort of anything more specific that you would like to add? I mean, I think these are the sort of points that I find interesting more generally speaking, but it is and there are some connections, maybe as a final point, between like the actual sort of school reformers like the Ferrers and the Sebastian Faure and so forth, Larouche and all these examples. So there are some connections between Kropotkin, the Reclus Circle, and these people. There are correspondences, there are.
Great, thank you. In the chat, we have a question for Shangshang, who Sean is having technical problems, so he cannot ask himself. His question is, what was the reception of mutual aid and its ideas in China, including Zhu Zi's work like? I wonder also how much China was gripped by the competitive and conservative social Darwinism that affected perceptions of mutual aid in Britain.
I would say it's a very good question, and it's also, I think this also contextualizes how mutual aid was accepted by China, because it was a time when Huxley was translated by a Chinese translator, but he actually used Spencer's ideas to define Huxley, and it was brought to China as Huxley's original, but actually it's full ideas of full ideas of Spencerism and social Darwinism. And in this formulation during that time, it's like all world is composed of various civilizations. For example, Chinese civilizations and Western civilization, so to speak. So varieties of civilizations, and it was also based, and it was considered that based on competition among the civilizations. And Kropotkin's work in China comes during that background, and it actually was a timely response to this social Darwinism. And so they based the supportive intellectuals of Kropotkin or even Tolstoy, so to speak, they will they'll say, no, it's not all about competition. Actually, there's a large part about mutual aid and love and friendship among these civilizations in order to survive and gain national rejuvenations. And these ideas were actually debated and combated during the turn of the 20th century and even practiced and experimented by different people with different ideas. So it's a very good question in terms of thinking about complexity of the social settings. Thank you.
Thanks. Pascale, I think you had also a question.
Yes. Well, thank you for that fascinating talk, Shangshang. I thought that was brilliant, and I really loved it. I've got a very technical, detailed question, in the sense that I found it really interesting that the stress on love in Xi Jinping's, sorry, I'm going to mispronounce the name. It's really Zhuji's work. And I'm really interested in that question because it's something that it's one of the things, I mean, I think one of the risks in my project is that I present these people as too similar, but it's one of the things where they fundamentally disagree on, because for Geddes, for example, he writes The Evolution of Sex, where he sort of distinguishes between a maternal, affectionate, loving drive that sort of gives rise to association, cooperation, and so forth, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a male, competitive, sort of the Spencerian and the Kropotkinian sort of within evolutionary processes and within the struggle for survival, so to speak. And Kropotkin very much rejects the idea of love as the basis for mutual aid. I think he cites some of these authors because there's also some French people and sort of writing about love in the animal world and Büchner and so forth. So he cites all these authors and say, no, it's wrong to assume love as the basis, precisely because it's not universalizable. Why would you say that? It can't be made universal because love is always specific to your tribe, to your kin, to your family or something. So it's precisely because of that he says, no, mutual aid has to be more broader and more general and more appealing. So I was really wondering, because what's so interesting about Zhuji is that he sees that he takes all these liberties with transforming Kropotkin. So I'm wondering, to what extent does he explicitly say, this is where Kropotkin gets it wrong, and this is what we should be? And to what extent does he say, okay, no, this is Kropotkin, the same as he says this is true Darwin or something? I'd be really interested, or if that even emerges as a potential problem, this focus on love. It would be really great if you could say a bit more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think it actually emerged as a problem in his argumentation, because he's citing Kropotkin, and at the same time he's citing Darwin, and he's citing all things that is supportive of his own arguments to make this book. So I think he's not actually taking all about Kropotkin, but he's actually making his own argument. in this Chinese refractions. And I think that's a very interesting point that you point out, that Kropotkin is actually very critical about love, but in Zhuxi's writing, love is something that is concerned of morality, an anarchist morality, and this lies in the center of morality. And I think it's very interesting dynamics in that Zhuxi took and reject what Kropotkin and other anarchists or biologists said.
Thanks. Does it answer your question, Pascal? Cool, thank you. I see in the chat we have a question from Tom, who asked Shangshang, has mutual aid among the Chinese ever been translated?
Like, to what sense it was translated? Do you mean translated into English, or because it's something that Zhuxi has rewritten Kropotkin's work? Like he just add a chapter of his own based on based on the whole translation of Kropotkin at the very end. So
he said yes into English.
I don't think so. No, it's not. It's not as far as I've read. It's not because like in the later years of later years of Zhuxi, he died because during the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, because he's like something like political activist and anarchist, and then there was almost 20 or 30 years that Zhuxi was forgotten in the Chinese history, as maybe he's remembered as a biologist, but not anymore, or not so much as an anarchist. So I don't think it has ever been translated in Chinese into English.
Thanks. We have a question from Sean to Pascal, who said, can you ask Pascal if she thinks these geographers, obviously including Kropotkin, have this connection to Russia because of it being considered very geographically heterogeneous and interesting? Obviously, similar things could be said about the United States of America, but in the 19th century, writers would probably be far more aware of Russian geography.
Yeah, okay. Super interesting question. I guess another big one. I mean, a lot of the times, like, it's interesting that you sort of specifically say, okay, that you frame it almost like they're interested in Russia, which is the case for like Perron, for Illy, and so far. But some of them just simply are Russian, like Meshnikov and Kropotkin. They just grew up there. But how does that matter, and why is it interesting? I guess there's a whole debate about why anarchism is so successful in Russia, which has to do with like sort of the historical distance between the state and the sort of lack of any possibility of liberal compromise, and nihilism, the connection to the nihilist movement and so forth. Like, I think there's a lot of very convincing arguments for that. And I guess what's interesting for these authors is that they are always sort of used to this process of translation and of a sort of peripheral position within European hegemony. It's interesting that they tend to frame themselves as sort of Europeans. And for example, like Mechnikov, who spends a lot of time in Japan, and I don't know if you know Sho Konishi's book about these Russia-Japanese connections, he himself presents himself very much as a sort of Westerner. Like he's quite, and that is an interesting point I find when they, and then there are like different arguments about the sort of specific geography of Russia, and especially like the comparison to the United States. I think one really interesting line of argument here. And I think what's interesting here is that it's not so much about the actual diversity of the Russian space and geography, but it's a lot more about the sort of stereotypes and imaginaries of the Russian territory. So, for example, Kropotkin himself describes coming up with mutual aid as, when I was in the Siberian tundra, what I observed in this harsh environment was that species actually collaborate, and that unlike the sort of rich tropics where you don't have this kind of environmental pressure to collaborate, there is a lot more sort of, you notice the prevalence of mutual aid a lot more in Russia, but this is ignoring that there are like tropical regions in Russia as well. And there's a whole line of argument that sees, because there's other Russian authors who do this kind of reading of Darwinism as being more about cooperation, and there is this sort of in itself environmentally determinist arguments that, oh yeah, the Russian environment just creates these different readings. And I think that's not entirely like, and the other way in which the imagination of territory works, and I'm thinking here of Mark Bassin's work really, which compares the sort of Russian frontier myth to the American frontier myth, sort of how do we deal with these open wide spaces, and how does having these open spaces like inform our political possibilities. And so Bassin's theory is that a lot of Russian revolutionaries have a sort of negative frontier myth, where they're like, okay, in Russia there could never be like this condensation of social conflict and this formation that led to the European revolutions, because there was always sort of more of an escape. So in a way, it's this sort of Russia's forever doomed narrative because of these open spaces. So I think there's definitely a lot in there. And I think what Kropotkin does is that then he is probably more inclined to turn this again into a more positive frontier myth, if you will, that it just opens up new possibilities for creating new spaces and so forth. So I'd say like it's not entirely that kind of negative reading that we get from other places, but there's definitely, I think especially in the 19th century and in the world view of 19th century people, like there is always this connection between Russia and the US. So I think that's a really important point there.
Great, thank you. We have two more questions in the chat. The first one from Cord is one question about the development of the Chinese countryside form of mutual aid. Does that mean that rather than anarchism as a world concept traced by Pascale, Juicy would emphasize different quasi-evolutionary developments of mutual aid, with some culture ending up with more pronounced altruism instinct?
I would say Zhu actually realized the Chinese cities, but he tend to emphasize Chinese countryside because he thinks that Chinese cities has a similar characteristics with the European cities, and because in the modern times, Chinese cities tend to Europeanize, and he thinks this aspect has already been discussed in detail in the Kropotkin's original work. And what he wants to do is try to justify that mutual aid is something as a natural distinct that already exists in China's pre-modern times. Like it tries to justify this continuity in the historical development. And I think this also something Juicy is more interested in justifying, like in asserting this universalness yeah.
Right, thank you. There is another question for you from Ole. The Malthusian element in Darwinism, the struggle for survival, etc., were generally not accepted in Russia, probably because the geography is different, as Pascal just said. Russia has enormous landscape and space for animals, so they don't need to fight, unlike the tropics. Oh my God, Pascal is saying the same as I'm writing this. My question is, might this have been a factor in the reception of evolution theory in China too?
I would say, like in the Chinese context, the scientific categorization of animals or a scientific exploration or research on animals and plants hasn't developed, and during even in the at the turn of the 20th century, there's all these local names and local names and local knowledge about plants and animals. And I think when it was after the introduction or the reception of Darwinism, social Darwinism, or Spencerism and Kropotkin. It's all after these ideologies that China or Chinese intellectuals and scientists started to put the local names into the international categories of plants and animals. And I think there's not so much consideration about geography in this sense as Russian did. But that's a really interesting aspect I also found that you raised.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any question, or do you have any question, comments yourself as speakers? I don't think. Oh, yeah. There is one last comment for Pascal saying, you may be. Oh, I think, can you read it? Maybe in the chat. I think so, yes.
Yeah. I'm definitely. Yeah, I know it's a brilliant article, but thanks again for reminding me of that, because yes, it can also be like, I think Tom is a lot more working on like the sort of cityscapes and the local scape, which are all part of. I think what part of what I want to argue is that it's not just about like the small communes and the sort of places of anarchism, and there's excellent work on that, but that there is also like a large space conception. I think that's something that we're not always aware of, that there is like that these two visions actually coexist and sort of condition each other. And I think that's a lot of what I want to argue, and Tom's work is incredibly helpful here. So thank you also for reminding everyone of that.
Okay, so if no one has anything else to add, I guess we can end the session here. Maybe if people just want to stay in here for now and use the chat, I'm sure you can feel free to do so. The next session will be in about 40 minutes, starting at 3 p.m. And it will be about Kropotkin in new areas. Yeah, so thank you so much both. That was super interesting, and the conversation was really enlightening.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions, and sorry for not being able to be there for the rest of the day, but have an excellent conference, everyone, and thanks so much to the organizers. Wonderful work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.